Most people walk past wisdom without even knowing it. In a world obsessed with titles and speed, we often overlook the quiet figures who carry the deepest strength. This story is about one of those men. If you've ever felt invisible despite everything you've done, or wondered if true influence still matters, you'll want to stay with this one. It's a reminder that legacy isn't loud, it's lived. And sometimes, the quietest presence leaves the loudest impact. If this speaks to you, like the video, subscribe for more stories that matter, and share in the comments someone who changed your life quietly. The academy sat quiet in the mornings, long before the cadence calls and shouting instructors filled the air. Rows of brick buildings stood like sentinels, stoic and sharp under the Virginia sky. Behind them, gravel paths wound through fields of trimmed grass, obstacle courses and old flagpoles that creaked when the wind moved just right. Chuck Norris showed up before all of it. Before the kitchen steam rolled out, before the first boots hit pavement, he moved with the rhythm of someone who didn't need a clock. His truck was old, the kind that rattled a bit when it idled. He parked near the equipment shed, stepped out, and pulled on a pair of leather gloves he had owned longer than any of the cadets had been alive. He didn't make much noise. The rake slid over gravel like a whisper, metal against stone, just enough pressure to leave the place neat but not polished. The kids liked it polished. They liked shiny things and ceremony. Chuck liked the function. He kept the lines straight and the gear clean. The cadets didn't say much to him. Some offered a nod when instructors were watching. Most looked past him. Occasionally one would joke loudly enough for others to hear. Old Chuck still thinks he's guarding Fort Knox. Don't trip over his rake or you'll get a full demerit in silence. They didn't mean harm, not really, but they didn't mean respect either. They didn't see him, not really. Chuck didn't respond. He let them talk. He let them laugh. He kept his head down and did his work. No one ever asked how he knew exactly which knots to use to tie down a wind-blown tent. No one noticed how the rifles in the shed stayed oiled without being lubricated. He kept it that way. On Thursday morning, the wind came colder. A storm was rolling in from the mountains. Chuck had stacked sandbags by the back wall of the range, just in case. He never asked permission to do that, he just did. He knew water better than most of them knew formation drills. Mid-morning, a cadet limped up the hill. He was young, his face still soft, and he had one boot untied, dragging slightly. He asked if he could rest inside the shed for a minute, said the wind was making his head spin. Chuck shook his head once, calmly. He said the shed was off limits during drill hours. The cadet looked confused, just for a second, then nodded and walked off. Chuck went back to organizing a set of weighted packs by size. The moment passed. At least, he thought it had. Not long after, a junior officer in a clean uniform and brand new boots came marching down the path. He had a clipboard tucked under his arm, and his mouth was already shaped like disapproval. He didn't greet Chuck. He didn't ask anything. He just stepped close and told Chuck he was aware of the refusal earlier. Chuck looked at him once, then back at the rope he was coiling. The officer asked why he thought he had the authority to deny access to the academy facilities. Chuck didn't speak right away. He finished the coil and placed it gently on the shelf. Then he said, calm as the sky before a thunderclap, that the shed held flammable supplies and cadets weren't to be left alone there. The officer raised his voice. He said that Chuck's job was groundskeeping, not making policy. He warned that continued overstepping would result in formal reprimand and possibly termination. He was using words like chain of command and operational protocol. Chuck simply stood still. His gloves were folded across his left hand. He didn't flinch, didn't posture. He just said that some spaces are locked not because of what's inside, but because of what people don't know they're walking into. He said it gently, without looking up. The officer paused, confused. He asked what that was supposed to mean. Chuck didn't repeat himself. He nodded once, and walked around the corner to continue stacking spare fuel cells for the backup generators. The officer stood there for a moment, clipboard still pressed to his chest. Then he turned and walked back toward the main hall. He didn't report anything that day, but he didn't forget either. By noon, the clouds had rolled in thick. The wind had picked up, pulling at the flag above the parade field. Cadets jogged past, shouting cadence, some still laughing under their breath about the guy with the rake who acted like he ran the place. Chuck stood at the edge of the gravel, one hand resting on the handle of his shovel. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't angry either. He watched them pass and then turned toward the shed, locked the door, double-checked the latch. He'd seen that look in a young officer's eye before. It always came right before someone opened the wrong door or asked the wrong question. He hoped that day wouldn't come here. But hope was never part of his job, only readiness. And Chuck Norris was always ready. The rifle strap had torn along the seam again. Emma held it in her hand, annoyed. It was the third time this month, and the supply officer kept saying replacements were on back order. She walked toward the maintenance shed, expecting to find tape or glue, anything to patch it until inspection. Chuck was there, kneeling beside a crate of field gear, sorting through worn canvas bags. She hesitated a moment, then stepped closer and held out the strap. He looked at it once and nodded. Without a word, he reached into his old leather pouch and pulled out a needle and waxed thread. His hands moved with a calm that didn't match the urgency she felt. One pass, then another, then a precise knot. He didn't rush, he didn't explain, he just knew what he was doing. She stood in silence, watching. There was something about the way his fingers worked, steady and exact, like he'd done it 1,000 times without ever thinking twice. She found herself asking before she could stop it, "Did you ever serve?" Chuck didn't look up. He tied the final loop, tested the tension, and handed her back the strap. Then he said, soft but firm, "Some things live in muscle memory longer than they live on paper." Emma blinked. That wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. She thanked him, tucked the strap under her arm, and walked back toward the barracks, her steps slower than usual. That night, after lights out, she sat at her desk in the admin center. She wasn't supposed to be using the database without a request ticket, but curiosity had a way of bending rules. She typed in his name, Norris Charles. Nothing came up, no ID badge, no payroll record, no background clearance, nothing. She tried variations. Chuck Norris, CD Norris, even last name only. Still blank. She leaned back in her chair and stared at the screen. Every contractor, every groundskeeper, every civilian support staff member had a file, except for him. She walked out into the night air, unsettled but not scared, just aware that something wasn't lining up. The next morning, she passed him near the greenhouse. He was trimming back the ivy with old garden scissors. She almost asked again, but he looked up at her, nodded once, and kept working. There was no invitation to push further, just a kind of quiet understanding. She nodded back. At that moment, Emma started seeing Chuck differently. Not like the man others joked about behind his back, but like someone who was exactly where he meant to be, doing exactly what he chose to do. It made her wonder what else he wasn't saying, and why no one else had ever thought to ask. The truck rolled in just after 6. Its engine coughed twice before settling into a low idle. It was an older model, military green, with rust edging along the bumper and a mismatched side mirror that looked welded on by hand. Chuck climbed out, moved to the back and began unloading coiled rope, folded tarps and a set of metal crates. The supplies were standard, things for field repair or emergency weather setup. He worked without pause, stacking with practiced ease, his breath visible in the cool morning air. By the time the sun cleared the tree line, a lieutenant had made his way across the field. He was sharp in appearance and sharper in tone. He called out before he reached the truck. Said the vehicle wasn't cleared in the system. Demanded an explanation. Chuck didn't look rattled. He leaned against the tailgate, gloves still on, voice level. He said the truck was part of the legacy fleet and used only for off-grid storage runs. He added that the contents were routine, but that one box, he paused slightly, should stay closed. The officer's brow lifted like he'd been challenged. He asked what was inside. Chuck met his eyes for the first time. Something in his voice shifted. He said, plainly, that the box wasn't for training use, and that if the officer didn't know what it was, he probably wasn't cleared to open it. That was the wrong thing to say. The lieutenant stepped past him and climbed into the truck bed. He flipped open crates until he reached the wooden one, darker than the rest, sealed with old military latches and a small coded lock. He studied it, then pried the lid loose with a crowbar from the shed wall. Inside he found canvas bags, a rolled tent, canteens wrapped in wool, and one container that didn't match anything else. It was matte black, no markings. The lock on it was newer than the rest, tighter, clean. He called out, asking again what it was. Chuck just stood near the wheel, which was quiet. Then he said that not everything heavy makes noise when it lands. The officer shut the lid, said he'd report it, said this wouldn't just go away. Chuck didn't argue. He gathered the rest of the gear, checked the tie-downs and drove the truck back behind the mess hall like it had never been there. No apology, no defense, just movement. By lunch, the story had made it down to the cadet ranks. Some laughed, said old Chuck finally got caught with his pirate loot. Others didn't laugh. One cadet said he saw the officer walk back toward command, looking pale. The next week, new cameras were installed around the storage yard. 4 of them are mounted high with infrared lenses and silent pan controls. No one said why. The maintenance crew was told to stay out of the lot after sundown. Security patrols quietly changed their rotation. Chuck said nothing. He still showed up at dawn, still raked gravel paths. I still cleaned the brass plaque outside the armory every Friday. But something had shifted. Not in him, in the way the others looked at him now. A little less like a joke, a little more like a question they weren't sure they should ask. The envelope showed up in the admin pile just after 8. Emma was sorting through sign-in sheets and field duty rosters when she spotted it. It looked different. No return address, no postage, just a thick off-white envelope with sharp corners and a name typed dead center in bold black ink. Charles D. Norris. It didn't match any cadet. Didn't match any officer either. Her mind jumped. Chuck. It had to be him. But no one ever used his full name. He barely used his first. She held it in her hand for a moment, turning it over. There was a faint watermark on the back, a circle barely visible under the office lights. She leaned closer. Inside the ring, the outline of an eagle, wings flared, perched on a sword. She didn't need to squint to recognize it. The Department of Defense. Her pulse picked up, quiet and quick. She slid the envelope into her clipboard and walked out of the building like it was any other task. Chuck was trimming branches near the rear access trail. She approached without speaking. He saw her, nodded once, and let the clippers hang by their cord. She held out the envelope. Said it came to the wrong inbox. He looked at it, expression unreadable. I took it with a small nod, no thanks, and no surprise. Then, he tucked it into his jacket like it was just another piece of weather. She watched him for another second. The breeze tugged at the leaves near his boots. He went back to work. That should have been the end of it, but something in her stayed restless. Back in the admin center, the inbox still held the copy machine key. It took less than a minute. She closed the blinds, slid the envelope open with a letter opener, and fed the pages through slowly, heart hammering with every flick of the feeder. The document was stamped, restricted at the top. One page, no greeting, no signature line, just lines of language that felt like they belonged to a world she'd only read about in clearance manuals. Activation notice, dormant security asset, contingency protocol referenced, class Delta Echo, location assignment reaffirmed, Bravo site, personnel 37. Authorization acknowledged by SecDef directive, await confirmation signal, remain embedded, maintain posture, do not engage unless provoked. She stood frozen, not by the words themselves, but by what they meant. Embedded, asset, maintain posture. She copied it twice. One she hid in her training manual, the other in the bottom drawer behind a false folder labeled Dining Requisitions. Then she returned the original to the envelope, sealed it again with a glue stick from the admin desk. No one would know. That night she couldn't sleep. The wind outside her barracks tapped at the window in long, uneven gusts. She kept hearing the phrase, maintain posture, in her head. It didn't feel like policy talk. It felt like something older, sharper. In the morning, Chuck was there, at the same time as always, sweeping dust from the edges of the drill court. She watched him from across the yard. Same gloves, same boots, same pace. But now, all she could think of was the phrase Personnel 037. She wondered who he had been before this place, who had written his number, and why the Pentagon still cared where he was. Whatever Chuck Norris was, he wasn't just a groundskeeper, not anymore, and maybe never had been. The sun had been pressing down since mid-morning, hot and slow. The drill field shimmered in waves of heat, the kind that warped air and drained strength without warning. The cadets pushed through the last lap of the circuit, boots pounding dirt, sweat darkening their shirts in uneven streaks. Lieutenant Howard had been pacing them, barking corrections between strides. He was younger than most officers on base, eager and fast, always trying to outpace the pack. On the final turn, he stumbled. His knees buckled before anyone noticed. By the time he hit the ground, the field had gone quiet. 2 cadets stopped. One called for a medic. Another ran toward the training office, but the radio inside was slow to crackle. No reply. No confirmation. Chuck saw it from across the yard. He didn't hesitate. His walk turned to a jog, direct and steady. He knelt beside the officer without asking for space. His hand went to the man's throat, and he checked the pulse. Too fast. Shallow. He pulled a multi-tool from his belt and used it to cut open the front of the uniform, loosened the collar, lifted the officer's legs onto a rolled tarp, and shaded his face with a jacket one cadet had dropped. The others hovered, but didn't interfere. Chuck tapped lightly on the officer's cheek and listened to the breathing. It was labored, but still there. He reached into his pack for a water pouch and dripped it over the pressure points at the wrists and neck. Not too much, just enough to help the body respond without shocking it. He asked for a flashlight. Someone handed him a phone. He opened the eyelids and checked the pupils, and they were slow but reactive. He muttered something under his breath that only one cadet caught. It sounded like a code. The sirens from the medic team came 3 minutes later, too late to matter. By then the officer had started to blink. His breath came slower, steadier. One hand moved slightly on the tarp. Chuck stood as the medics took over. He didn't wait for orders. He gave a quiet nod and stepped back toward the tool shed. The medics didn't ask who he was. They were too busy doing what he had already done. That afternoon, he was called into a side office near command. The air inside was cooler. The lights felt too bright. A captain waited at the desk, arms folded. She asked him what authority he had to intervene. Asked who cleared him to perform field triage. Chuck didn't sit. He said the man was dying. That waiting would have made the difference. That sometimes you act first and explain later. She stared at him for a long second. Then he told him a formal inquiry would follow. Chuck nodded once and left without another word. Outside, the drill field had already been cleaned. The cadets were back in formation, but a few of them, the ones who had seen everything, kept glancing toward the far shed. toward the man with the gloves who hadn't broken a sweat, the one who knew exactly what to do. The room was quiet when Chuck walked in. 4 people sat at the long table, their uniforms crisp, their expressions already set. A 5th stood by the door, clipboard in hand, pretending not to watch him too closely. No one told him to sit. He didn't ask. He stood near the end of the table, hands behind his back, eyes steady but not confrontational. The head of the academy, a silver-haired colonel with a rigid posture, opened the meeting by listing what they called a breach: medical interference, unauthorized equipment, chain of command violation. Chuck listened without a shift in breath. When the colonel finished, the room waited. He nodded once, then spoke 5 times. I did not apply for this post. I was placed here under directive. I respond only to threats, not orders. If I leave, so does your failsafe. And if the box ever opens, no one in this room should be near it. The air shifted. It wasn't fear exactly, more like something ancient settling into the walls. A presence none of them expected, but all instinctively respected. The colonel blinked, mouth half open, unsure whether to speak or ask for clarification. Then the door opened. A senior aide from the Pentagon stepped in without knocking. She crossed the room in 3 quiet strides and leaned close to the colonel. She whispered only a few words, but they drained the color from his face. He cleared his throat. Took a moment longer than he needed. Then he closed the folder in front of him and looked at Chuck as if he were seeing him for the first time. The inquiry is closed. You are not to be questioned further. Thank you for your continued presence. Chuck nodded once. That was all. He turned and left as quietly as he had entered. The room stayed still for a long time after he was gone. No one wrote anything. No one spoke. One officer finally exhaled. And the aide at the door said softly that some people don't carry rank, they carry clearance. And that's a different kind of weight altogether. The headmaster called for her just after the final drill. His tone wasn't sharp, but it left no room for delay. Emma followed him across the quad, past the cadet dorms and the chapel, into a side door she had never noticed before. The hallway beyond was narrow and lit with a cooler kind of light. They walked without speaking. At the end of the hall, he used a key and a code to open a steel door. It clicked twice before it released. Inside was a small room, cool and windowless, with a long table and a locked cabinet built into the wall. He opened the cabinet and pulled out a single grey folder. It looked ordinary, just heavier than it should have. He placed it on the table and sat across from her. Then he told her to read. The cover read, Norris, Charles D., clearance, Delta, Echo, status, embedded. Below that, in red, eyes only. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The first page was a service record, but not like any she'd seen before. No rank, no traditional unit, just Commander, Shadow Directive, Pacific Detachment. Then came mission logs, most of them blacked out. Years listed without detail, dozens of countries, no medals, no citations. Only checkboxes marked completed. One photograph showed a younger Chuck standing next to a helicopter that had no tail numbers. His face looked the same. Hard to age when your eyes already hold more years than your skin. The second half of the file changed tone. It wasn't about missions. It was about this place. The academy. Diagrams, blueprints, layers beneath the ground she had walked every day, vault access, perimeter breach protocol, emergency lockdown sequences. At the center of all of it was his name, not as executor, as an architect. He hadn't just protected the school, he had built the system that made protection possible. It was dated 1982. She hadn't even been born. She looked up, barely breathing. The headmaster's voice was quiet when he spoke. He said Chuck was part of a program that doesn't exist anymore, a defense strategy from the Cold War era, when people thought danger could come from anywhere, even from within. He said the wooden box Chuck guarded was the final switch. Not a weapon, not a bomb, but a signal device designed to bypass all normal communication in case of internal compromise. It could shut down power grids, redirect satellites, lock out digital threats before they reached classified networks. The only people who ever held those boxes were given 2 orders. Stay hidden. Stay ready. She whispered a question she already knew the answer to. Why him? The headmaster leaned back, said there were men who took credit. Then there were men who carried responsibility without ever needing it to be seen. Chuck had chosen the second path a long time ago. Emma sat back in her chair. Everything she thought she knew about her job, this school, the people around her, it all felt small now. She thought of the gloves, the boots, the rake, the silence. And she understood something she hadn't before. He wasn't protecting this place because he worked here. He was here because he never stopped protecting. The headmaster closed the file and locked it away again. Then he said what stayed with her the longest. He didn't choose to be noticed. He chose to be effective. And sometimes, the most dangerous man in the room is the one you walk past without ever knowing his name. He was gone by the time the sun came up. No one saw him leave, no trucks, no goodbyes, just a small stack on the bench outside the equipment shed, his gloves, his hat, and a folded piece of paper, with Emma's name written in tight, careful handwriting. She found it before breakfast. The hat was the same one he always wore, soft at the edges from years in the sun. The gloves were laid palm up, like hands that no longer needed to hold anything. She picked up the note and held it for a long time before opening it. The handwriting was neat, all caps, written with a black pen. It said she asked the right questions. It said leadership wasn't about being the loudest voice, but the quietest presence that holds steady when the rest falters. It ended with one sentence that stayed with her long after the ink began to fade. Sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is step away without needing to be followed. She read it twice, then I folded it back and held it close. She didn't cry, not then, just stood there in the cool of the morning and looked out over the empty field where he used to walk. 3 days later, a package arrived from the Department of Defense. No sender, no instructions, just a dark wooden box sealed with a single brass clasp. The headmaster opened it in private, then called Emma to his office. Inside was a small metal plaque, weathered and simple. At its center, a medal unlike anything in the Academy's records. It was dark silver with no ribbon or shape that matched the current service awards. Just a single inscription on the back. For protection without recognition. They mounted it on the wall in the central hall, just beside the flag display. No explanation, no speech. Just a small plaque with a clean brass plate. Charles D. Norris, service complete. The students passed it every day. Some still joked quietly, the way people do when they don't know what else to say. But the jokes faded. The laughter dropped to a whisper. After a while, even the newest cadets asked who he was. The older ones didn't say much, just told them to read the words, told them to watch their steps when they passed the plaque, told them the campus was safe because someone had made sure of it long before they arrived. Emma kept the gloves. Not because she needed a reminder, but because they fit a kind of silence she'd come to understand. She never saw him again, no one did, but every time she crossed the field at dawn, she looked to the trail behind the shed. And in that quiet moment, when the wind settled and the ground was still, she felt it, the weight he left behind. Not heavy, just steady, like something that had always been there waiting to be noticed. Not every uniform is stitched with thread. Some are built from choices, worn in silence and carried by men who never need a salute, only the space to serve and the grace to walk away when the job is done.